Okay. When they asked us to merge our talks into one talk, we kind of interpreted that as changing our talks a bit and presenting here together. And I see now that we're the only ones doing that. So I hope it will not be too chaotic, but I think it will be fine. So we will be talking about ground state correlations and dynamics of TJ models using neural quantum states, a classical method that we will explain to you guys. So we're both from Munich, Ghent University, and yeah, let's take it away. So a bit of motivation. So we're interested in strongly correlated matter. So quantum many-body problems, and we will try to describe these kind of materials. And as Marcus and Henning already explained before, we're interested in these cuprates, which have a very interesting phase diagram, where we actually don't know everything about and which are still very much in debate. And one thing that we're also interested in is explaining these with, or like looking at the Fermi-Hubbard model, as they show a very similar phase diagram, and they might explain some of these properties of these cuprates. This Fermi-Hubbard model is a mathematical model where you basically have this interaction term and this hopping term in a two-dimensional lattice. And at half filling, this is well understood, but still a lot of things are under debate, and we will focus mainly on the TJ model. So this is a strongly interacting model, limit of this model, where you basically have such strong interactions that you don't have any double occupancy. So you limit your Hilbert space to the single occupied sites. You still have this hopping term, and now you have these nearest neighbors interaction terms. And also this model is very hard to describe, and we will try to do that with a classical method. As we've seen before, you can do that with quantum simulation platforms, like Marcus did. But we will do this with the classical method, more specifically with neural quantum states, which is a variational method, which Annika will explain more about. And we will use this to describe the ground state properties of this this TJ model, and look at the ground state correlations, but also describe the dynamical properties of these kind of models. What happens when you hole dope the system? What does this hole do? And definitely at the finite doping, this might be very interesting. So, okay, what are these neural quantum states?
I just clicked the green thing. Okay, yeah, hi everyone. So I'm gonna start by giving a brief overview over what these neural quantum states are. So as Anka mentioned to you, it's a classical numerical method, and it's a variational ansatz. So you can think of it very similar to, for example, tensor networks, which I am sure you're all familiar with. But instead of a tensor network, we are now optimizing a neural network. And the way that it works is something like this. So we have a mapping from Fock space to the complex numbers. So the input of our network is going to be some Fock space configuration, and then the network outputs a complex number that is then the amplitude that's connected to this correlation. Okay, so why should we use neural networks? Why is this a good idea? One answer is that there are these so-called universal approximation theorems, which tell us that in theory, as long as our network is large enough, we can approximate any continuous function. So we should also be able to approximate wave functions using this type of ansatz. And what's very nice is that it has been shown that some of these NQS have an even higher expressivity than tensor networks. So from a representability point of view, this is a larger class of quantum states that we can represent, because now it has been shown that certain NQS can encode volume law entanglement, which we know is very hard for tensor networks or matrix product states. And then also these ansatz, it's a super flexible ansatz that we can use for a variety of different systems, especially systems, again, that are hard for other state-of-the-art methods, like large 2D systems or systems on completely periodic boundary conditions. Because we have all of these different architectures, sort of from the machine learning community available that you can see here, yeah, we really have now a method that we can very finely tune to the problem that we have at hand. Okay, and of course, you all know there's no free lunch, so the big question remains here is how to actually optimize the state. So this sort of representability argument is one thing, but just because we can represent the state doesn't mean we can always efficiently find it. And I want to just walk you very briefly through the optimization process of how we do this in practice. So again, we have this function that goes from the Fock space to the complex numbers. That means we can now also represent this, at each point in our training, the network represents some kind of probability distribution given by the Born rule. And we can then start by sampling from this probability distribution by just some Monte Carlo scheme. And then on these samples, evaluate the cost function. The cost function can be lots of different things in this context. The most intuitive one is when we just look for the ground state, it will be the energy of our system. And then we evaluate the average energy of our samples as well as the gradient. And we can use this then to also further optimize the energy and minimize the energy and optimize these parameters theta here. Okay, and then it's an iterative process, so we can just go through this step by step until we hopefully converge to this desired target state and minimize this cost function of the network. And I just want to mention here that this is now a completely self-contained training. So often when we talk about machine learning in physics, it has something to do with training on some data. This is not what we're doing here. So all that we sort of input into our model is really the Hamiltonian of our system. Okay, so this is the very general framework. Now, Anka mentioned to you guys that we are interested in the Fermi-Hubbard model. So what we need to do is find some way to make all of this fermionic. And we can do this by basing everything on a Slater determinant. So yeah, this architecture has been proposed, and it's been called hidden fermion determinant states. And the main idea is that we approximate the fermionic sign structure here by starting from some Slater determinant, which we know for free fermions is the exact ground state of our system, but we also know that it's just a mean field state, so there are no correlations. And if we want to describe a strongly correlated system, what we need is some way to introduce correlations in the system. And this is done by going to this hidden fermion representation. So we make our Hilbert space larger, represent everything as a Slater determinant in this large Hilbert space, and then we map back to our physical Hilbert space, and this mapping back now makes everything configuration dependent and therefore allows us to introduce correlations in the system. And now what we did in some recent work was combine this ansatz with the ansatz of Gutzwiller projected wave function, which in itself, okay, you can see here it's been around since the 60s, so it's not very new, but it's also very powerful. So these Gutzwiller projected wave functions essentially take this Gutzwiller projector that you can see here, which is what we saw in the TJ model, the projector that gives us on or brings us into this TJ subspace, where we exclude all of the double occupancies. And just applying this to your variational wave function itself introduces a lot of correlations, but it turns out that this is super hard to deal with numerically. To deal with analytically, just because we have this product over all sites, and this is a pretty nasty term to work with. But as it turns out, in our VMC framework, we can just very naturally include this essentially without any computational overhead by including this in the sampling process. So remember, we trained our network by drawing samples and then evaluating the energy on those samples. And what we can do is just restrict our network to a sampling space that it's now exactly this Gutzwiller projected part of the Hilbert space. So our network will never actually see any samples that have double occupancies. And this way, we can very naturally include this Gutzwiller projection into our ansatz. Right, and then the combination of these two separately very powerful schemes here is what we then call these Gutzwiller projected hidden fermion determinant states, and we are going to use those to study the Fermi-Hubbard, or for now, the TJ model. Okay, so what are we going to actually do with this? We're going to look at some ground state correlations. So here you have, again, the TJ model. We have this nearest neighbor hopping and some spin interaction. And the first thing that we did is just compare some energies. So does our neural quantum state actually give us a reasonable result? And what we see here is very nice. We compare it to some DMRG simulations, and we see that we actually get very good agreement across all of these different system sizes. And we can, as I mentioned earlier, even go to systems that are very hard for MPS to reach, like these large 10 by 10 systems, or then also these like shaded green dots that you see are for fully periodic systems, which again is something that we can't do with DMRG. Okay, and then you can see this from this figure, but I just want to mention it because I think it's also very cool. We reach these energies with an order of magnitude lower parameters. So for tensor networks, we just have a lot more parameters that we need to describe our state. So here we really have a very efficient parameterization in terms of these neural network states. Okay, and then we went ahead and actually analyzed these ground states that we found. And here, if you went to Marcus's talk yesterday, you already saw these kind of pictures of holes moving around in an antiferromagnet. So these are the basic excitations that we care about, these magnetic polarons, essentially these doped holes that are dressed by some spin excitations. And we can study how they evolve with doping by studying these nearest neighbor and next nearest neighbor spin correlations. And this is what you can see here. So in the zero doping case, we start from this antiferromagnet, and then we start introducing more and more holes and see how these correlations behave. And it kind of happens what we expect. As we have more holes, they perturb more and more of this AFM background, and we find that these correlations decay. But what we also see is that at some point, this next nearest neighbor correlator changes sign. And this sign change is kind of telling us there's a qualitative change in the underlying physics. So here, this polaron picture really breaks down. Polaron picture breaks down, and we have to find some new physics to describe the system. And what's very nice is that the region or the doping value where the sign change happens agrees very nicely with some experimental results on a similar model where they also tracked these correlations and found the same region for the sign change. Then I told you we can also do fully periodic systems. So one nice thing that these NQS allow us to do is track the momentum space density. So we can really track the Fermi surface evolution as well across this full doping range, which again, also this going to arbitrary dopings is also something that's not trivial for other methods. But here, because we have this efficient representation, we can really do this very well. Okay, and then another thing that we did was look at sort of some longer range interactions. Again, something not easy to do, but we can do this for the NQS here. And we look at this 5-point correlator here, which again just tells you something about the perturbance of this AFM background. But one thing that's pretty cool here, what we see is that once we change the T prime, or once we include some next nearest neighbor hopping, what we see is that the region where this correlation changes sign again becomes different. And since we know that sort of having a different T prime corresponds to a particle or hole doping your system, we can then compare this to the phase diagram of the cuprates again. And what we see is that the fact that this correlation sort of changes sign at a lower or higher doping agrees very well with the fact that in the cuprates we have a different AFM region in the hole or particle doped sites. Okay, and then one thing I just want to mention, I'm not going to have, for the sake of time, won't go into this, but we have an extension where we can apply the same architecture to SUN symmetric models. So we did this for the SU3TJ model. If you want to know more about this, I'm very happy to talk to you. But until then, I will give over to Anka again, who will tell you more about dynamics in these systems.
Okay. So as we said before, we're also interested to look into the dynamics, the time evolution of these kind of systems. And it's also, of course, very hard to look into this because you have this build-up, or you can get into very nasty states during your time evolution. But we will show you a method how to do this with these neural quantum states. So typically, if you think of time evolution using neural network, using tensor networks, you think of discretizing your time and going step by step, and basically finding the tensor network at the next time step. With neural quantum states, you can do the same thing. So you have a neural network that represents your wave function at a specific point in time, and then another neural network that represents the wave function at the next point in time. And you can do this, but of course, we know that these neural networks are universal function approximators, so we can also, instead of just representing our wave function at a specific point in time, also represent our wave function at all points in time. So we can take a continuous time parameter as an input and really let our neural network represent this wave function over the whole time interval that we're interested in. So this is now a continuous representation, and we don't have to discretize our time interval into time steps. But as we said, it's a very nice, expressive ansatz, these neural quantum states. But how are we going to find the correct representation? And how are we going to train the neural network such that it represents the correct wave function at all points in time? For this, we need a different cost function. So we don't no longer minimize the energy to find the ground state. But we're now interested in finding a solution to the time-dependent Schrödinger equation. So we have the time-dependent Schrödinger equation that we all know and love. But of course, this gets very nasty for very large system sizes. So we approximate this with these variational Monte Carlo sampling. And we try to minimize the error according to the McLaughlin variational principle. So we minimize the error that we find for all points in time of the time-dependent Schrödinger equation. And now that we have this continuous representation, we can basically integrate over all time steps and do this training for the whole time interval all at once. This sounds as a very complicated cost function, but we can actually evaluate this quite efficiently. So now that we have our time derivative in one side and our Hamiltonian applied to our wave function on the other side, which we already had in the ground state energy search, but this time derivative we can also evaluate efficiently, as we can now do automatic differentiation as time as an input parameter into our neural network. So this is not as bad as it looks, and we see that we can actually get some nice results with this. Of course, this wave function is now has to be very expressive, so we use a bit of a more complicated architecture instead of a simple feed-forward neural network that I showed you. We do this actually with a transformer. These are very complicated. This is a very complicated structure. I won't go into detail, but you might know it from large language models like ChatGPT. They're also based upon this architecture. So I want to highlight that this is now a global optimization scheme, and we have to train one neural network to describe the whole dynamics of the system and no longer go step by step, which is very nice. So we did this for a couple of different quenches. So we started with looking at the transfer field Ising model, of course, like a real physicist. And we did that for very large system sizes. And we see that this actually works very well. So we can do this for large system size, but also look at any kind of boundary condition. As Annika already mentioned, we're not limited by that. And but one other nice thing about this kind of optimization technique is that we don't have this trotterization of our time interval, of our time operator. So now we can easily also deal with time-dependent Hamiltonians. So we see that if we quench time-dependent Hamiltonian, we actually get no difference in evaluating this cost function. And we get some nice results for an 8x8 system here as well for a Heisenberg antiferromagnetic state preparation, which is very interesting for quantum state preparation protocols. So that is also a very nice quality of this kind of method. And lastly, I also want to mention a project that has been led by Tatiana, a PhD student from Innsbruck that's joining our group soon, where she used this kind of method to look at density operators and not just pure states. So she basically used this Lindblad master equation instead of the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, where she minimized the error of this over a whole time interval and represented the whole density operator with these neural quantum states instead of just a pure state. And of course, this is a very hard problem because you basically have to cross this entanglement barrier, which grows with system size and which makes everything very complicated for most numerical methods. And this works pretty well with this time-dependent neural quantum state method compared to other methods. So that's all very exciting. But let me bring the whole talk together with this fermion dynamic. So Annika already mentioned how you represent fermions with these neural quantum states. I discussed how you make this then time-dependent, so we can combine this all together into a time-dependent fermion representation of our wave function, and we can use this to study the whole hopping into our TJ model, which is also, I think, very nice. So yeah, that was our talk. I hope it interested you, and if you have questions, you have 1 minute.
Fantastic. Okay, time for questions.